We spent 6 years with Veronica, and when little Anastasia was born, I was over the moon. My happiness knew no bounds, and my wife, finally embracing motherhood, shared in that joy. But sadly, our bliss didn't last long. After Anastasia was born, she began falling ill far too often. My wife and I, desperate to find answers, visited every hospital and private clinic, trying to figure out what was going on. Then, after one particularly bad episode, the doctors suggested she might need a blood transfusion. So, they rushed her in for immediate tests in the emergency room. After a long, tense wait, the doctor, with a flat tone, listed the results. White blood cells are elevated, but the formula is fine. Red blood cells are low, hemoglobin's low, and hematocrits down too. Blood type 2. That's odd. I interrupted, my voice rising. Both my wife and I have type 1. That's just not possible. You must have made a mistake. Darling, sit down. You're not well. I turned to Veronica, and I saw her face flush deep red, then pale as a ghost, before she slumped to the floor, sliding down the wall. I was just worried, she whispered, her voice trembling. I just need some air for a bit, she said softly, and staggered toward the exit. With Anastasia being taken away for an ultrasound, I couldn't leave my wife alone in such a state. She looked even paler under the glow of the streetlights, like some delicate porcelain doll. The only thing that told me she was alive were the tears that trickled down her cheeks. Honey, we got the strongest little girl in the world. She's a fighter. She'll get through this. We'll get through it together, I reassured her, trying to keep my voice steady, though I could feel my heart racing. Veronica clung to me and broke into quiet sobs. Valerie, I'm so sorry, she whispered again and again, her words muffled by her tears, like a broken record. It took a few minutes for her to regain composure, the panic fading, and then she began speaking, her voice soft but steady. Her words marked a point in our lives. Everything changed, and we would never be the same again. I do not know. How can I explain this? We were so wrong. I was wrong. Do you remember last summer when we celebrated the anniversary of the company at our friend's villa? You said you weren't feeling well and that you were tired of all those snobs in ties. We argued for ages. I lost my temper, ran out of the room, and was left alone. It's a pity you weren't there. Everyone else was paired up. In the end, I drowned my loneliness in wine. When it was over, I switched to cognac, and, well, I probably drank more than I should have. After that, everything is a blur. The last thing I remember is going into the house to wash up and get my bearings. I think I was going to call a taxi home. I was dizzy. I was constantly stumbling. My shoes were covered in mud. And then I saw the gap. The next thing I remember, Owen from another department was there. He gave the taxi driver the address, handed over the money, and slammed the door. As the cab drove me home, I slowly started to come back to myself. I got into the apartment, and you were already asleep. I went to the shower to wash off the alcohol and cigarette smell, and that's when I noticed my skirt was inside out, and I had no underwear on. At that moment, her gaze fell into the darkness, and tears began to spill again. I suspected he was capable of something like that. There had always been rumors about him, things that didn't make a difference whether he was moving or not. Well, then, she couldn't continue. A wave of nausea cut off her words, and I couldn't bear to hear any more. My throat was tight. A lump lodged so deep it felt like I couldn't breathe. In that moment, I understood just how alone I was. No wife, no daughter. Yes, just for the sake of my daughter, or at least the girl I had come to love as my own. I pushed through the rest of that day. I couldn't bring myself to take Veronica and the baby home from the hospital. The pain of betrayal was suffocating. It was clear now. Owen really had slept with my wife, and I couldn't bring myself to forgive that. We tried to make it work for another month, but honestly, it felt like torment. Eventually, we both realized it was better to get a divorce, to stop dragging out the agony. Veronica went through with the paternity test because Owen kept denying everything, right until the very end, stubbornly rejecting the truth. He had his bride waiting for him at home, the one he'd been with for just a year. The result, unsurprisingly, wasn't a shock to anyone. Well, except for Owen's bride. She couldn't bring herself to forgive him for the mess he'd made, and who could blame her? A child on the side is hard to ignore. From what I've heard, Owen and Veronica are trying to work things out. He's trying to play the role of father, even going as far as registering the child in his name. But it's clear he's not yet ready to bring her into his family. You might wonder, what happened to me? Honestly, I'm still trying to make sense of it all. Still trying to figure out why fate decided to throw me this curveball. But there's one thing I'm sure of. A drunk woman is no longer the master of her own body.